With great power comes great responsibility. It's the principle that guides Spider-Man, and it can also be applied to this week's guest on Here Comes Pod, Peter Schlessel. At Sony Pictures, Peter launched the phenomenally successful genre label Screen Gems and rose to become president of production. He founded the finance production and distribution company Film District and later ran the iconic Focus Features. He's been in the most important rooms in Hollywood. We talked about dealing with the responsibility of these powerful positions, the importance of backing talented filmmakers like Tim Burton and Rian Johnson, and how the negotiation to unwind a deal with a B-movie producer called Menachem Golan brought Spider-Man to Sony Pictures and helped kickstart the ascendancy of the superhero genre. Enjoy. Hi Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Danny. Happy to be here.
Excellent. Great to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question to get the creative juices flowing. And for you, my question is this. A Supreme Court ruling grants Peter Schlessel the contractual ability to secure the remake rights to any film in the history of Hollywood. Which film would you choose to remake, and who would you cast to star?
Okay, so I think I have two answers to that. I said, first one would be, if I could get Rian Johnson to do something, I would do whatever Rian Johnson wanted to do, because I think he's such a great filmmaker and such a great person to work with. If it was only up to me, there was a movie I think it was in the 80s, early 80s, maybe mid 80s, called The Razor's Edge. Bill Murray was the star of it. And I remember seeing it. I was in law school at the time, and I remember seeing it. And the movie was about searching for what happiness should be. And the movie's flawed, which is why I think it's a great remake opportunity. I hate when they remake great movies. But this movie spurred me to really want to travel. And so I went to Europe after I graduated law school, and I went to Europe after my first year as being a lawyer. And that movie really sort of set the tone for me of wanting to explore and get out of my comfort zone. So I think someone could make a great movie with that as the bones of it.
Growing up, were you a big film fan? And then was that part of the inspiration for you to then move into your first job in the movie business at RCA Columbia Pictures in 1989?
I grew up having two passions, sports and movies. I grew up on a little town in Long Island, and they had a double screened little tiny theater. And I went almost every week, even when I was young. And sometimes I would go by myself. I couldn't rally friends to go. So whether it was playing sports or watching movies, those were my passions growing up. After I graduated law school, I worked for a law firm, big law firm in New York called Simpson Thacher. And I knew it wasn't for me after a year or a year and a half. And I started thinking about what I would do next. And there was one partner at the firm that did some entertainment work. And it was really like corporate work, setting up Michael Douglas's production company. And I would camp out outside his office as a second-year lawyer. Every morning at 8:00, I'd bring him coffee. And I'd go, do you have any entertainment work that I can do for you today? And with the very little that the firm did, I got the chance to do a bunch of it and started looking for a job. And I would have been happy working for the NBA, and I would have been happy working for a movie studio. And I ended up interviewing with RCA Columbia probably 6 times before I got the job. And the job had only opened because Jim Giannopoulos had left the head of the division, and everyone else had gotten a promotion up. And so there was a junior slot available. But I'm friends with Jim, and I sometimes call him my great-grandfather because he was 3 levels up from where I was. And so when he left, it opened up the opportunity. And started in New York at RCA Columbia, which was a joint venture between Columbia Pictures, which was pre-Sony, and RCA. And it was a company that was on the cutting edge of DVD, not even DVD, it was VHS at the time, distribution. The New York office was such an interesting place to start because there were a lot of assistants and there were a lot of very senior level people, and there was hardly anyone in the middle. And it was sort of an odd place. I'd have lunch with the assistants because the presidents and EVPs had no interest in talking to me, but I learned a lot. And then after 2 years, they moved that division out to California after Sony had bought RCA Columbia Pictures, or actually just bought Columbia Pictures. There was a famous meeting. John Peters, who was head of the management team, was Peter Guber, who I consider a mentor of mine, and John Peters, who was his partner. Peters comes in, calls the whole company together. We were in the Coca-Cola building on Fifth Avenue, and basically said, every one of you is being fired. We're eliminating all of these jobs. Nobody will have a job in a few months, so I just wanted to give you a heads up. And then he walks out of the screening room. The next day I got called in and said, if you want to move to LA, you're one of the select few that could move to LA. I went home to my wife. We were like, yep, let's pack up, let's go. And it was the best thing that I've ever did. It was my best decision ever from a professional standpoint. And when I came out to California, all of a sudden everyone was my age, because all the marketing and sales people and finance people that had been in the California office, mostly doing the US and Canadian work, and the New York office was mostly international work, plus the C-suite. Now I got a chance to be in a group, a very dynamic group of people that were trying to do new things in a new space. And I was very aggressive in going to meetings with the sales group, the finance group, the marketing group. Even though I was a lawyer and I was the lawyer for the acquisitions group, we were buying movies from other people. But I wanted to understand what about everyone else's job was important, so that when I was negotiating these contracts to bring in the movies, I would have a firm understanding of what it meant for us to handle a movie as a company. And it was a great time to learn. And I really didn't learn from my bosses. I really learned from the bosses of all of the other groups. And it was a great learning experience. I worked every weekend and I didn't care. Like, I'd go in every Saturday morning at like 6 a.m. because there was so much to absorb. And I always wanted to push back the work at everyone else. And it really set the tone for my whole career.
And what was your observation of the wider influence that Guber and Peters had on the studio at that time? Because it's been chronicled in books like Hit and Run and has become one of the case studies of the business, where you were there on the front line.
Yeah. So I was really junior and actually became close with Peter many years later. But the one thing that Peter brought to the studio was excellence. Peter strived for things to be more interesting, more dynamic. He fixed a lot up. He cared about the aesthetics and he cared about the quality. And, you could see it from his life now, where he's a part owner of the Dodgers and a second owner in the Warriors and owns the LAFC, multiple Academy Awards. So I think Peter set a tone, and there was a lot of great business execs at Sony in those days that I learned from, guys like Ken Lemberger and Ben Feingold. And there was a lot to learn. And then, you get lucky in your career. I went in and told the president of my division that I thought I was not getting paid enough and didn't have enough responsibility after 4 years. And he said, don't worry about it. Don't worry. Give me a couple of weeks to figure it out. And then 3 days later, he gave notice. He quit the company and went to run an AT&T company. And all of a sudden, there was a new boss. And the new boss didn't really know me, but he had heard from all the other heads of the division that I was a key player in a lot of what they were doing. So he sat me down and he said, I don't want you to leave. I want to promote you. And in one of the great moments of my career, I said to him, I'm interested in that, but you have to promote my friends as well, because all of the people that I was working with that I felt were underutilized were people that needed to be promoted. And if he was going to believe in me, he had to believe in my vision and my assessment of these other people. And Clint Culpepper was one of those people. He ended up having an unbelievable career at Sony. He and I formed Screen Gems. Lexine Wong is still the head of marketing for all the ancillary business at Sony. She's been there 30 plus years, an unbelievable exec. And then Adrian Alperovich, who ended up being one of my partners in my professional life, was a very, very junior finance guy. But I knew those three people were all stars. So I wanted it to be a package deal, and Ben Feingold agreed to it. So that was very, very fortuitous.
You focused on film acquisitions. How important were acquired titles to the overall Sony slate? And how did your approach and the approach of the team to acquisitions differ from other studios?
So when I got the job running acquisitions, when all these people got promoted, I think the business for Sony was a 20 to $30 million profit business. And it wasn't super integrated with all the other divisions. And one of the things that I set out to do when we first got promoted was to enlist the help of the TV division. So the guys who ran the TV division at the time was Michael Grindon, who I know you've spoken to, who's an excellent executive. And there was a gentleman at Sony named Barry Thurston who had no interest in helping, but he was replaced by Steve Moscow, who was very interested in helping. So Steve and John Weiser and the domestic team and Michael and his guys on the international side, they opened up the keys to understanding what the distribution divisions needed by the way of product. And so going into film markets, knowing that we needed 6 titles in Portugal and 9 titles in Latin America, and here's what they would be able to sell them for, and here's what it took to qualify those movies for those deals, allowed me and my team to go into the market and acquire lots of movies. We ended up acquiring, I think, 100 movies in our first year. And then we were averaging way over that. And our profitability went from 20 to $30 million from the group to about $200 million in the group. And so we had a very bottom up approach. I think some of the other acquisition people at the time would buy one movie in Germany and spend a lot of money for the territory and a lot of money to release it. And it became a very execution oriented result. Like if the movie performed theatrically, they would make money. If it didn't perform theatrically, it was going to be a wipeout. Where I would go and buy a lot of territories on smaller movies at the time. So we were buying great movies like Big Night and The Usual Suspects, Shallow Grave, and we would buy a basket of rights. So we would end up giving Michael Grindon's guys 15 territories that qualified for all of their deals. So we were creating enormous amount of profitability while maximizing the studio's distribution channels, because they would have 25 or 30 slots in an international deal, but the studio was only producing 12 movies. So that gave me 10 to 15 movies to be able to program in any single country. And so it became a very, very big business for us at the studio. And it all really exploded for us when John Calley ended up becoming the chairman of the studio in 97, because he met with me and he goes, look, I'm a production exec and I'm not really sure I understand what an acquisitions program does. And I asked him if he would give me a month to come back to him with a proposal. And he goes, good, yeah, come back to me with a proposal, because I don't really understand acquisitions and I'm thinking you guys are going to be out of a job. So I wanted to give you a heads up. And so it gave me a chance to sort of rewrite the narrative of what acquisitions was at the studio. And I had testimonials from all the division heads. And then we had the finance guy, the CFO of the whole Sony Pictures, was like, no, these guys make $200 million a year. Like, you can't actually get rid of them. And John, who was a great exec and really a guy that, had produced big movies with big directors and had run, this was his second studio. He was Stanley Kubrick's producing partner for years. Callie said, how can I help you? Tell me the one thing that I could do to make your job easier. And Clint Culpepper and I started Screen Gems in 1997 as an alternative theatrical distribution label, so that we didn't have to ask the heads of Columbia or TriStar to bless the theatrical release, that John would make sure we got theatrical releases, but it wasn't going to impose on anybody else's label. So we were free to make movies that were, let's say, gritty. We had John Carpenter's Vampires. We had Arlington Road, that maybe the studio chairs, Stacey Snider, Amy Pascal wouldn't want to make, but that if we made, we knew we could, or bought, we could slot them in and start to make real theatrical profit, as long as the marketing and distribution team at Sony were on board. And I think Screen Gems is now up to over $4 billion of box office since we formed it in '97. And Clint ran it for a lot of years and did a really amazing job for the studio.
And I also recall there were the movies that were based around action stars that had maybe seen slightly better days, yet those films in the action genre were so popular,
Yeah,
particularly amongst the international TV community, and I'm sure also on DVD as well. Was that an interesting process to go through to find those films?
it was an interesting process. Those movies had to be made outside of a studio system because they would generally cost, less than 10, but sometimes less than six. And whether it was Jean-Claude Van Damme or Steven Seagal, they would be getting $3 million out of a $6 or $7 million budget. And a studio couldn't do it, either from a production standpoint or from a legality standpoint, make these movies for that price the way they would make them. And they were perfectly positioned at a time when DVD was exploding and there was a great appetite overseas for those movies. And we tried to break stars all the time. I remember putting Val Kilmer in a few when he was on the downside of his career, trying to get him to become an action star. And they had tons of, Olivier Grunier was a French star that at the time that people were trying to make into a star. But it was a really interesting part of the program because you were competing against almost everyone else in acquisitions for those movies. And so you had to figure out why you were the proper person. And, a lot of us became friends with those stars, even though they were all a little bit, let's say, nuts. And, but they were an important part of the program. Though they were not movies I personally liked to watch, but they were movies that were definitely going to make money for us.
In the book, The Big Picture, previous Here Comes podcast Ben Fritz writes, in 1990, a young lawyer named Peter Schlessel, working for Columbia Pictures' home video operation in New York, was asked to help unwind a deal with a B-movie schlockmeister named Menachem Golem. Schlessel had no problem letting go of most of the low-budget movies on Golan's slate, except for one that caught his eye, Spider-Man. Fast forward to May 2002, and Spider-Man broke the US box office opening weekend record and ultimately became Sony's biggest franchise. Can you, from the horse's mouth, share your Spider-Man experience at Sony?
Yeah. So when I first started at RCA Columbia, I was asked to make a deal with this low-budget producer, Menachem Golan, at a time when VHS was really becoming a big deal. Blockbuster was, selling these movies. And we made a 20-picture deal with Menachem, and we were paying $750,000, I remember like it was yesterday, for US and Canadian VHS rights. And there was a list of 20 movies he was going to make. And that deal probably got amended 4 or 5 times over a 2-year period. And in the beginning, the movies were pretty good for what they were, and we would make a good amount of profit. But then we had a couple of movies that did not perform well, and we found out that Menachem had shot them in a parking garage for over 3 days for like a couple of $100,000, and we were paying $750,000 for the rights. So we moved to terminate the deal, and my boss at the time was pressuring me to close it because she wanted it done, and because it was an embarrassment for us, and we were potentially going to sue Menachem. And I just kept on saying to myself, like, we're going to terminate this deal, but Spider-Man is something that Like, why would I give up the rights to get Spider-Man if they ultimately ever made it? So that was it took about 6 extra months to close because I just refused, even though my boss at the time was pressuring me. And eventually, because Menachem didn't want to get sued and he was tied up in not being able to make other movies till this deal was done, they finally agreed that the deal would be terminated. But to the extent that they had any rights in Spider-Man, we retained those rights in the US home video and Canadian markets. And it sat there for a couple of years until John Calley came. John Calley came from MGM to be now chairman of Sony. And MGM had the TV rights, if I recall. I think it was the TV rights. They either had the TV rights or the theatrical rights to Spider-Man because in the 80s, Marvel was a bankrupt business and they had leased out and made deals with lots of people for different iterations of the comic books and different rights. And when Calley came over, he had the genius brainstorm to trade for the theatrical rights from MGM or the TV rights. And what we gave up was the rights to make the spoof Bond movie that Sony had made. And so we gave up whatever rights we had in 007 to get whatever rights they had in Spider-Man. And then Yair Orlando, I think, was running strategic planning. He ended up acquiring from Paramount. I think they had whatever MGM didn't have, Paramount had, vice versa. And so ultimately, all of these rights ended up at Sony on a worldwide basis, but they had originally started in 3 different studios. And then the studio was able to go and make what was one of the first superhero movies in Spider-Man, which was a great movie.
In 2000, you were promoted to president of production at Sony Pictures. What does a president of production role involve, and how did you manage the transition from the deal making and running Screen Gems, which you, as you mentioned, have been doing now for 3 years?
Yeah, so Screen Gems and acquisitions at the time were still reporting to me, and they were doing really great. It was a great business, and I loved running it. I had no production experience. So Clint Culpepper was the production exec. I was sort of the business marketing distribution overseer. And so he would do most of the creative work and I would do most of the business work. I was at an offsite meeting. I tell this story sometimes to young people that I mentor, and they were talking about the previous year's slate. And I was the most junior person in the meeting. There's probably 15 people. And they brought up a movie that they had made. It was called Crazy in Alabama. And that movie had been directed by Antonio Banderas, who had made Zorro for the studio the year before and then wanted to direct. And, totally for all the right reasons, the studio said, we don't want this guy to leave. We want him to be happy. So we're going to make this movie with him. And he was directing Melanie Griffith. And the movie turned out to be a good quality movie, but very artsy and very small. And the studio had released it with about $20 million in advertising, prints and advertising. And the movie ended up doing $3 or $4 million at box office. The movie only cost like 12 million. So it ultimately lost about $30 million for the studio. And I raised my hand, and my boss at the time kicked me under the table. But I raised my hand, and John Calley called on me, and I'm like, I'm not second guessing why the movie was made. I understand. But if you had asked me, I would have gotten this movie pushed out through the Samuel Golden Company or Sony Classics or one of the other smaller distributors. And we would have spent $2 or $3 or $4 million to release it. And we would have still done $2 or $3 or $4 million in box office. And I would have had a profit because I would have been able to place it in all the overseas deals. And with all of that, we would have ended up break even or slightly ahead. And John Calley goes, who's going to answer that question? And it wasn't meant to challenge anyone. It was just meant to think about other ways the studio should be leveraging all of its assets and all of its potential partners. And I walked out of that meeting and went home and said to my wife, I'm either getting promoted or I'm getting fired. I don't know which one. And a couple of days later, I got asked to meet with Amy Pascal, who I knew a little bit. And she said, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was already 40 years old, so I felt grown up a little bit. But I said, I want to be the business head for the studio. And she said, no, you're the new president of production. And I said, I think you have me confused with Clint Culpepper. He's the one who should get that job. And she goes, no, we want someone who's different. So that's a long way to get to the answer in your question. I did president of production, I think, differently than anyone had ever done it because I didn't come in with tons of talent relations or 10 years worth of experience reading scripts or manipulating talent into deals. I was a business person who thought first always about whether this movie had value for my distribution colleagues. And I always used to categorize these movies into three categories, like the one where the distribution guys say, thank you. That's the goal. Like, thank you for giving me this movie. It was okay if they said, I know how to handle this movie, and then they made money on it. And it was terrible when they said, why did you give me this movie? So everything I always did, I always thought it through those things. So when I'm president of production and I have all these talented creative execs working for me, I had to figure out what was my value inside of the group. And I knew it was not going to be giving script notes. I'd have script notes. And as a lawyer, I thought very logically, but really I thought the value was, how do I make their jobs easier? What are the problems that they have that I can unstick? But also, what are the things that we need to introduce into the group that will make everyone better? And one of the things I had them do was we put about 25% of our scripts in turnaround within the first 3 months because we were spending so much money on scripts that no one really believed in. I asked them to all categorize their development into movies we were going to make in the next year, movies next 2.5 years, movies that they believed in, but they didn't know when. And they had to be a fourth category and everything had to be 25%. And all that fourth category mostly put in turnaround. And the other thing I tried to do was when the creative execs, especially the young ones, would come into my office, they would inevitably say some version of, I'm really passionate about this project. And I would always stop the meeting and say, you're in the president of production's office of the studio, so I'm going to always assume that you're passionate about the project. So that's not a reason why you're here. The reason why you're here is you have to explain to me why this movie will add value to the studio and why the movie will work for our colleagues. And sort of that rigor, I think, helped coalesce because Amy was an amazing creative exec, and there were 3 or 4 EVPs that were really talented, some of whom have done amazing things in their career. But I think the rigor of thinking it from a distribution and financial perspective was something that they hadn't had in the group for a while. And the results were really quickly to pay off because we went from, I think, the 7th or 8th studio in 98 and 99. I took over as president of production in 2000. And certainly Spider-Man helped, but we were 1, 2, or 3 for the next 3 years. And so that was because those guys got to do their job, but I think with a different kind of wraparound on it.
Are there titles that stand out from that period that really you think benefited from that different approach?
Uh, I think there were some, Charlie's Angels was a little bit of a mess when I took over, and we dug it out into I think a really fine first film, and McG did a great job on it. Even the way we approached Spider-Man, I think because I had so much influence, or not influence, but experience in the independent world, I was very on board with Toby. I'd seen him in Ice Storm, and Sam really had come out of independent, so he totally, and he had directed Toby, so that was a really good choice. That I think being able to come into the group and seeing more movies than most of the creative execs, because the wife and I used to go to 2 or 3 movies every week at that time. So I knew all the cast and I knew all the talent and they knew all the writers and they had a better sense of the directors. So it was a good combination. It rounded out what I knew, and certainly I tried to help with the things where they hadn't seen people. But I think a lot of what my being there allowed them to do was say no to movies that they may have said yes to. So I don't want to take, especially in the first couple of years, take a lot of credit for the movies that got made. Maybe I helped them negotiate better deals or think through casting choices in a different way. But I think helping them avoid some of the movies that had come out at the end of the 90s and put more of a dollar sensibility on the way they viewed the movies was a big help.
And do you think coming from a slightly outside perspective made that easier to be the person who could be pointed to say, we've got to go in a different direction? And did you end up having to introduce yourself to a lot of people and then get to know you a bit better?
Yeah, so it was crazy. The day that I got announced as president of production, the studio anticipated that I may be getting a lot of calls, so they gave me two assistants that day. I got 800 lunch invitations on the first 24 hours. So that day and the next day, and I literally had double lunches for almost a year, where I'd have a table at the Rita Hayworth dining room at 12:30 for some lunch, and then I'd have a salad, and then I'd have an entree at 1:30 lunch, because I was well known amongst independent sales agents and well known amongst acquisitions people, but I was not well known amongst talent agents. So every talent agent needed to meet with me, and every producer on the Sony lot needed to meet with me. In fact, there was one producer on the Sony lot that we were in production on a movie, a cantankerous old guy who I had lunch with my first week. And because I didn't know anything yet, I was just starting and I wasn't a production exec. He was not satisfied with my knowledge of his slate. So I had to have a second lunch with him the second week, which I brought one of the creative execs to help me out on. So it was a tense thing of introducing myself to the town, but it also was a great time to say to people, what would you do differently? What do you think? And I didn't try to pretend that I knew the things I didn't know. I was learning on the job. It was like going to, higher education. But having lunch with producers and agents throughout Hollywood was a great chance to say to people, what would you do differently? What do you think the opportunities are? And I was able to integrate some of that and bring that into my group. And we had really, really smart and talented people. And Amy was a great boss. She was so good with script, and I think I was good for her because she would fall in love with the projects, and it was good for her to have someone that could say, why are we doing this? Tell me again. And so it was great. And I really didn't appreciate her job until I was the green lighter for my own movies, how hard that job is. But it was a great experience learning from her and working alongside her.
And you mentioned the green light process. What was the green light process at Sony at that time? And do you think that's probably evolved a bit?
I think we made it a little more rigorous when I was there, but it was a good process in that, numbers were run, people were canvassed. I think where studios break down is when senior people don't have strength of their conviction in both advocating and not advocating for a specific movie. And I've seen it, in my own company, and I've seen it for the companies I've worked for. You don't want people who are just going to say yes because that's what the boss wants them to say. Ultimately, the boss gets to decide. That's why they're the boss. But your job as an employee, I think, and as a good colleague, is to always be honest and not necessarily think you're right, but tell your truth in that situation. And so when it was working great, it was because people appreciated other people's point of view. And we had a pretty tight group at Sony, both in the creative group, but also around the studio. Most of the senior execs appreciated each other. So I'm not sure it was different than in any other studio. People were allowed to express themselves, and that was a big deal at the time.
And in that process, I guess there's a sort of creative gut instinct, and then there is the analysis. How do you strike a balance between the two? Because sometimes the numbers might tell you something that great creative might end up trumping and vice versa.
Yeah. So I always try to think about things more analytically, but I will say that there were movies that made no sense on paper or were more challenged on paper that I was 100% supportive of doing. And Big Fish is a perfect example. Like that was a tough movie to pencil out on paper, but Tim Burton's a great director, and that script was really wonderful. And it ended up being a good movie. And if it was a great movie, which it was close to being, the numbers would have been great. And we probably broke even on the movie, but it was one of those movies that if you hit it, it could be something super special. And in a slate, in a portfolio, there has to be room for movies that people believe in. You can't just make the movies that pencil out because you'll be stale creatively, and you want your creative team to always pushing for what they believe and then have the healthy process to decide what ultimately gets greenlit.
You hear tales from filmmakers usually of the studio sending people down to shut a film down or oversee them. And ultimately, there must be times where, as a studio executive, you have concerns about the direction that a movie's going in. At what point do you know when a movie's not working out? And what can you do about it?
I'm not sure that you ever really know. I mean, you can get very nervous about it. I think one of the things you have to be cognizant of when you're making movies is that once you hire the director, it's his movie, and so you have to be as rigorous as possible in hiring the director. I've seen too many times when the studio exec tells their vision or aspirations for a project, and the director then parrots back that vision. And so you think they're on board, but they really are going to make the movie they want to make. So it's incumbent upon you to not tell people what your vision is and hear what their vision is. And so that was something I learned early and tried to instill in the people that I worked with. Let's hear what they think. And you can react to it. I mean, once you're at some point in the process, it's almost impossible to shut things down because it's a complete write-off. And then you're in the mode of how do you make it better? And it's a sometimes a very contentious project. I had one project at Film District where I disagreed with how the director was doing it, and he said to me in a very aggressive way, "I have final cut. You can't do anything to me." And I looked at him. I go, "That's 100% true." I go, "I have final cut on how this movie is going to get distributed. So I don't know if your final cut is stronger than my final cut. We should not be using that as words of aggression. We should be figuring out how we can do this so we're both comfortable with the process." And sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. And bad movies are part of the game. Like no one has avoided having a bad movie or a bad result or a miscast or a miscast director.
You left Sony in 2004 and began advising DreamWorks after being bought by Paramount. And you also advised on the establishment of participant media. What was it like being outside the Sony fold for the first time?
Yeah, so I got fired at Sony for disagreeing about some of the green lights, but in a very typical Sony way. Sony was a very emotional but warm place. They were like, "You're fired." I actually worked for 4 months after I got fired as the president of the studio, working because they didn't have anyone to replace me. So I didn't feel comfortable leaving, and they really didn't kick me out, even though they had fired me. They fired me in September. I left in January. They kept me on the lot. Amy was amazing. She was like, "I may need you to do something for me. So like stay close." They gave me an assistant. They gave me a nice office. And I started doing this consulting. The DreamWorks thing was amazing because, Stacy Snyder was someone I always had looked up to. And she asked me to help her as DreamWorks was transitioning from being a universal based company with a lot of distribution assets of their own and marketing assets to work at Paramount, where Paramount was going to do most of the distribution, marketing, back office functions. So they needed to both reduce the size of their company, but also come up with a new business plan. And so I would go up to DreamWorks 2 or 3 times a week and work with her lieutenants. Actually, they gave me Jeffrey Katzenberg's old office, which was about a football field long. So that I felt very small in this large office, and I would see Stacy a lot. And that was maybe a 3 or 4 month gig, but I really felt like I had helped them figure out what it was going to take for them to be successful at Paramount. We hired some new people. That we hired a new head of marketing for them and helped them with the transition. The participant thing was something else. I had been introduced to Jeff Skoll, who founded eBay, so was a multi-billionaire. He had done some work in town. Someone at CAA, Rick Hess, had asked me to meet with him. And I said to Jeff, if you really want to start a production company that has a social platform as part of the reason for existing, I said, move into my office and we can work together a lot. So in my office was Leah Booman, who had been my assistant at Columbia, but now was my director of strat planning. And she was working for Sam Raimi on the side. And I had another assistant. So Leah was doing a lot of things. And Leah and I worked with Jeff to come up with the business plan. I even came up with the name Participant myself. We were at a ton of branding companies. We could not come up with a name. We both were sort of disappointed. We got into my car. I was driving Jeff back to the lot. And I said, let's start from the beginning. I go, what are you looking for? What does he want the company to stand for? And he said, I want people to participate. And I go, how about participant? And he goes, okay, I love it. Let's go. So that was the name. I ended up helping him hire all of the staff in the beginning. I served on his board for a couple of years. And it gave me a chance to do a lot of things that when you're at a studio, even if you have a big job, you get siloed a little bit. And now I was out in the independent world. One of my best friends, Joe Drake, was producing a bunch of movies with Sam, and I helped sell those movies. Funnily enough, we ended up selling them to Sony, which was great. And then a couple of years after they fired me, they called me and said, we need you to come back. And I went back to run acquisitions for them I thought it was going to be for a year. I only signed a year contract. I thought it was a bridge thing, and I was okay with that. And then there were some management changes. A very close friend of mine who was head of HR at the time and other things, Beth Burke, left the company. And all of a sudden I had all of her responsibilities, not in HR, but in overseeing the lot. And I got promoted back to the theatrical group. So I was running acquisitions, and I hired someone to work for me for acquisitions. But now I was overseeing the lot. We built 2 new TV buildings, a new gym, a new food service. I had food tastings. We interviewed coffee vendors. So I had all this production of the lot, not production of the movies. And I had movie responsibility, and I was the senior business person for the studio. So it was a great 3 years to go back there, which I never felt like I had left, even though I'd been out of a job. So I went back, and I felt like when it got to be 2010 that I had done everything I could do there. And to stay was a choice to keep on doing the same things. And it would have been fine. It just wasn't what I wanted. And we were coming off a couple of great years at Sony. We had bought the Michael Jackson movie, which was amazing. Michael had just died, and AEG had been working on a documentary of him, but they had no plans on it. They were just filming him getting ready. We got to see the footage that they had, I think it was in July, and in October, the movie was in theaters. And it was a time for the whole studio to galvanize. And I was there from the very beginning, and we had to work with Sony Music, and we had to fend off other studios who were trying to pretend like they had rights to it. And after like a couple of those things, it just felt like, okay, I've done all of it. We had D9, which was an amazing thing. When I was in between my stints at Sony, I was working on the Halo movie with Mary Parent, and Mary got Peter Jackson to executive produce it. And we found this young filmmaker, Neil Blomkamp. And then Halo ultimately didn't get, because one of the studios chickened out at the last minute. And now I'm back at Sony, and Peter Jackson had worked with Neil in taking Neil's short and turning it into a comic book, basically, a lookbook. It was a 100-page lookbook. There was almost no script. There was a 10-minute video of Peter Jackson talking about his vision for the movie. And they showed it to me first because I had worked with them on Halo. And I drove back to the studio. I saw it like 7:30 in the morning at AFM, calling every senior exec. We have to meet in Amy's office at 9 o'clock. I don't care what you're doing. Come to the office. And I showed him the book. I showed him the 10 minutes. And they were like, you want to spend how much on this movie with no script? I'm like, look, what's the worst it can do? Peter Jackson, sci-fi. There's a floor to it. There's the time to push in. And I got everyone's buy-in. And Mark Weinstock did a great marketing campaign, and the movie was a huge hit. But there was only so many of those that you could do. And so I wanted to go and start my own thing.
And that thing was Film District, which brought together all your experience in acquisition, production, distribution, and financing. I guess the push or the what you just talked about in terms of needing that new challenge was quite an important part of why you set things up. How did it compare to what you'd been
Uh,
doing at Sony?
yeah, I got very lucky. I knew that there was a opportunity for a independent genre-based theatrical distribution company. I had met with all the theater chains, and they were thinking about doing a joint venture, which they ultimately did, and it was called Open Road. So I knew that there was interest, and they had asked me if I wanted to run that joint venture. And honestly, they just weren't paying enough for me to do it. So Graham King, who was a friend of mine, and we had talked about doing a lot of different things together. He was backed by a billionaire out of Texas named Tim Headington, and Tim agreed to finance Film District. And within a year, we had Insidious in the marketplace and Soul Surfer, which were two nice pieces of business for it to come out of the box. Adrian Alperovich had come over from Sony to be my COO, and we had made a deal at Sony. So Sony was handling our ancillary distribution, video and TV in the States, and we were able to work with them theatrically on movies that were good for both of us. So we were agnostic if it went through our system or through the Sony system, but it was our money and it was our marketing when we did it that way. And we had a couple of good movies to start. We had a little bit of a rocky period. And then I ultimately ended up hiring two great execs in Jim Orr to run distribution. And Jim's now the head of Universal's distribution, and Christine Birch, who actually had come over from DreamWorks. And with their help, we had a string of some really solid performances like Olympus Has Fallen, and Insidious 2 ended up doing $80 million after the first one had done 40. So we were doing really well. We had a bunch of strong development, and we were able to maneuver for movies like Looper and really knock socks off of the ball on Looper. And then we were thinking about how we were going to grow the company. And the truth was, I saw the writing on the wall that Netflix was now really being aggressive in acquiring movies. And some of the other studios had seen our success at Film District and were now aggressively in the acquisitions business. And movies like Looper, I thought were going to be far and few between for us. And so when we bid the next year on Nice Guys and The Arrival, which were two movies, when I bought Looper, we paid $5 million for the US rights. And for Arrival, I bid 17 million and didn't get it. And it was sort of the same value movie in the marketplace. I knew our profit margins were going to be seriously hurt. And Universal had called and said, would you be interested in running Focus? We want Focus to be more of a genre label. And so over a few months, we met with them, and we saw how much more value our movies would be through a studio system than doing it the way we were doing it, which was paying distribution fees and not having top of the market deals. And so we went over to Focus, and it didn't really work at Focus for a lot of different reasons. They were in transition. I think Jeff Shell came in right after I had gotten hired, and he really wanted more of the traditional Focus movies, which was not the strong point of myself or of the people we brought over. And so we had some hits there, and it was great to work on movies like Theory of Everything. So it was great to work with the Focus Movies Theory of Everything and Danish Girl. So I got a chance to really see what an Academy campaign looked like from the inside, and the cast on those movies were just such lovely people. It was fun to hang out with them during the award season. And in like 2014 or 15, it was enough. I was happy to leave and start a life of consulting.
Looking back, what would be the biggest lesson from your career that you would pass on to your younger self?
I think patience is always a good thing. Like, patience on not sending the email, patience on thinking through what you're feeling, giving the time for it to really decide if that's the way you feel. Something I talk to a lot. I mentor a lot of young 20-year-olds. I probably am mentoring at any given time 3 or 4, and then they get a little older, and then I check in less with them. And this somehow somebody new is asking me to meet somebody's cousin or someone's friend's daughter. I talk about being a good colleague a lot. I think it's really important, especially in a world where you're not always in the office, is to seek out your colleagues, try to understand what makes their job work, like I did early on. And I think if you can think about how your actions, whether it's personal or professional, impact other people's personal or professional, you become a person that's a cog in a company. And it's easier for people to support you if they feel like you're doing it on behalf of the right things and not personal things. Being interested also is like really important. Like being interested in your work, and being interested in what your colleagues are doing, and being interested in why the company does certain things allows you to actually affect change. And if you want to be a leader, you have to understand what everyone is doing. Because if you don't, I've seen too many people who get promoted from a senior job to a more senior job. And what they do is they do their old job. They micromanage their old job as opposed to learning all of the other people's jobs that are now reporting to them. And so that's a really important lesson, is to be interested.
Finally, if you were offered the chance to program the Peter Schlessel film marathon in your favorite cinema, which films that you either released or were involved in or with would you choose for that screening marathon?
Oh, wow. All right, let's see if I can do this in some kind of chronological order. Usual Suspect was a very important film for me and Clint. It was one of the first high profile films that we bought international rights to. And it's a genius movie, but it's a very complicated movie. And Clint and I learned a real lesson from the movie, because the first time we screened it for all of the senior people, we were sitting next to each other. And we had not seen the movie yet either. So we were seeing it for the first time. And somewhere halfway through the movie, I think Clint went out because he was so nervous that the movie wasn't working, and came back and like dug his nails into me, like, we're going to get fired. And the movie ends. It's a genius movie. Everyone loves it. They all get behind it for the territories we bought. And it taught me a lot about trust the filmmaker, trust your instincts a little bit that the movie is going to be good. So that was an important first movie for us. Crouching Tiger was a very important movie, I think, for me, also one of my favorite movies. The Sony Classics guys, who at the time we had a sort of contentious relationship inside of Sony with, asked me for help in securing it because it required a bigger deal than US and Canada. And I worked really closely with Michael and Tom, and we ended up buying the rights for most of the world on it. And it was an enormous hit. And I think it was a game-changing hit because, first, the visuals were so unbelievable. Ang is such an amazing director. But also, it was one of the first big commercial foreign language movies that was marketed to the masses. And it wasn't just a silly genre movie. It was a movie of substance. And so I was really proud of being able to bring that into Sony and working with those guys, and it really helped our relationship with the Classics people. The Wedding Planner was a really important movie for me. I was running acquisitions. I think Screen Gems had just been formed, but it was too big a movie because of J Lo and Matthew for them to sell it to Screen Gems, and it was at a script stage. And Amy Bear, who was one of the EVPs at Columbia, was like, "Oh yeah, I can help you with this." And so the two of us lassoed it for the studio, and it ended up being a really big hit, and I think really helped the studio's relationship with Jennifer at the time. And we made a bunch of Jennifer movies, but it was the first movie that put me on the map inside of the studio about delivering big commercial movies. That was the first big commercial movie that we had for the States. I would say District 9 was a really, really, really important movie for me, just because we got to work with Peter and because the studio believed in me when I said we have to buy this movie. And the team galvanized over it. And it was very exciting to go down to New Zealand and see Peter's studio. And then probably I would end with Looper. Looper was maybe my favorite film district movie, and working with Ryan Johnson and Ram Bergman was great. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt was so good in the movie, and it was a huge hit at Toronto. And it made us feel like we could get any movie in town. And I was so proud to be associated with the movie. So I would say probably those are my top movies. Maybe Olympus Has Fallen also was a huge hit for us at Sony. And Antoine was such a, not at Sony, at Film District. And Antoine was such a great director to work with. So those are probably my top movies.
Very good. Well, Peter Schlessel, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. Once upon a time, you taught me to play blackjack in a casino in Prague, but today I feel I've actually hit the jackpot with you coming on the show and sharing memories from a fascinating career and stories from Hollywood.
Thank you, Danny. It was a pleasure to be here.